it's only fair that I introduce myself as well. So I'm Eric Olson. I'm the engagement and partnership lead at Orchid for North America. I work with most of the research communities in the US and Canada, including government agencies, funders, resources like facilities and labs, publishers, among others. Orchid itself as an organization is made up of about 30-ish people, and we have folks spread out all over the world, several here in North America, but we want to cover all of the regions, as we have someone in every major region. So myself, obviously, here working in North America. So first, a little exercise here. So this, what we're going to talk about today, will be particularly relevant for you if you have, or if the folks that you work with have been affiliated with multiple institutions already. Once you change jobs or change institutions that you work with, you start having name confusion, real quickly lose track of where your work is. If you've changed your name in some way, if you've been married or changed your name, that name is attached to the papers you've written or the things you've produced, that can already start losing track of what you're working on. If you lived in a different country, if you've moved, the ways to contact you need to be connected to your work have changed. If you've had your name appear in multiple ways, if you publish across disciplines, for example, the citations look different, your name will look different based on which disciplines you publish in and their citation styles. And if you've seen others with similar names, even in your discipline or in other disciplines already, very quickly you can see how your name and your work can be confused and you're not easily found and distinguished. So the alternative here to using just a name for a person or for your papers or for your organizations is a persistent identifier, or a PID, which will always resolve. It's unique to that object or to that person, in Orchid's case. And so that's, I have an Orchid ID. A lot of people named Eric Olson in research, it turns out, but only one person has my Orchid ID. So when it's on the papers or data sets that I work with, someone might try to Google that name and come across a whole lot of things that aren't me and that aren't mine. But if they use my Orchid ID, they will only find my work. So a little small here, so I'll read through some of these things, but here's some of the reasons that we rely on persistent identifiers rather than names for people and for institutions. So on the individual, right now researchers are managing their work in a lot of different systems, including sort of the publicly accessible profile systems, the academia.edus or even LinkedIn. They're trying to manage their work there, as well as those that are at their own institutions. Profile systems at universities are notoriously bad. I don't know what the case is for all of the federal agencies, but I would guess it's not much better, certainly decentralized. So that's a lot of work they have to do to keep those things updated. A lot of that updating is happening manually. They're trying to keep track of their CV or their profile system by entering that data about their new papers or their new data, new resources manually. That's a lot of administrative burden. That's a lot of time spent just keeping track of the things that they do, not doing the research, but just trying to plug it in. And when they submit grants or when they're updating those profile systems, the national academies have done studies on just the sheer number of hours that are spent by researchers on things like this, and it's extraordinary, hundreds of thousands of hours just on this administrative work. And then when you put your data in some of these systems, you've lost control of it. Those systems will now own it and shop it out. Obviously, there's the name ambiguity problem, as we've discussed. Being able to have those contributions that you've made connected to you affects that recognition and credit for the contributions that you've made for your institution or to your field. And we don't rely simply on papers anymore for the ways that we contribute to research. We have lots of ways that researchers contribute through data sets, through instruments, through models, and through education resources. It's not just papers that have somewhat consistent workflows and infrastructure, but many other things that maybe don't yet. And then there are challenges for organizations that overlap to some degree with these challenges for individuals. They want to know what these individuals do or are doing, but they have the same challenges of, they have an Eric Olson at the university, but how do they know that they're looking up when they're Google Scholaring to see what I did this year? How do they know that they have the right person? They need to be able to trust the metadata that they're collecting, which not necessarily you can do that if your program officer or your grants officer is just using, again, Google Scholar to try to track this information down, which many of them still do. Reporting latency, you're waiting to the end of the year trying to keep track of what your researchers' activities for the year. The delay between when something is published or when something is active in the community and when you go and get that information can be significant. The systems are siloed. Even on a campus or in an agency, there are many, many different systems that are interacting with research, from the HR systems to research information, the activity tracking systems, the repositories. Those systems don't talk to one another and exchange data, at least not in really consistent ways. Being able to be able to do all the rest of that is a way to calculate return on investment. If you're spending a lot of resources training or providing resources to your faculty or to your grad students or even undergraduates, being able to track what they do, are you getting a return on these resources that you're making available? It's very, very difficult if you can't get a consistent data or you have that reporting latency. And then just discoverability. If your researchers are doing a lot of work, but no one knows that those researchers are at your university, at your agency, then you're losing out on a real valuable connection there. So this is just an illustration of an individual's use case. This researcher here is talking to a colleague. So I'm a 38th author, but not just a 38th author. He's a 38th author on one paper who's named Wang. And that's the paper here in PubMed. So that's, for those authors, that's a real challenge to make sure that you're distinguished from peers that have similar names, or at least publish under similar names. So of the more than 6 million authors in the major journal citations and abstract databases, 2/3 share a last name and a single initial with another author. And in many of the citation styles, that's enough right there to be immediately confused with other individuals. So this ambiguous name in the same database refers to, on average, 8 people. So again, names, really not a great way to make sure that your work is findable. So at Orchid, we have a broad vision that there's a world where all who participate in research, so again, not just the faculty member, not just the staff scientists, but those that work with data, the data wranglers and data modelers, or those who produce resources, who produce curricula, they should all be uniquely identified so that they're not being confused with others that have similar names, and connected to their contributions. So when they're developing data sets or they're developing or publishing papers, they can be connected to those across time, disciplines, and borders. So that's that persistent part. And these connections matter because that's what research progress, programs, and careers are based on, that communication of ideas. And then these connections are made possible by a network of partners that work together with the purpose of improving how we share research information. So Orchid is not doing this alone. We do it in conjunction with publishers, with funders, with agencies that are producing research like you do here. So for Orchid's part, we do several things. So we are an identifier for researchers. We'll see some examples here, but you might already have one. That's 16-digit URI. We are a registry of all of those identifiers. Almost 6 million researchers have registered for an Orchid ID. This is happening on a global scale. We have participating organizations in over 50 countries all over the world. ORCID IDs are integrated into workflows like in publishing and in repositories and funding, so it is easy to share accurate information between these systems. And then that's all done through a set of standard procedures, in our case, APIs, to make these affiliations and activities talk between systems that normally they wouldn't be able to. So we'll sort of take a step through several of these and see some examples here. So for an individual to get an ID and start using one, they can register. It'd take them 20 seconds to register for an ID. It's completely free for an individual to register for an ID. Super fast, super easy. And then at that point, they just start using it. So they publish a paper and they ask them to include their ORCID ID. There's a specific process for that. Again, it'll take them a few seconds to collect that information, and they're going to start having their contributions included on their ORCID record with minimum manual entry. So I created a record here just to get a sense of what this is, a brand new record of information that is included, most of it being reflected here. A name that doesn't necessarily have to be mine, but the one that I publish under or that I want to be found by. There's my ORCID ID here. This is in our test environment, but would be orchid.org, and then that 16-digit number that's going to be unique to me and will always resolve to this record. I can put the other names that I publish under or I appear as in different citation styles so that they can find me through that as well. I can include information about country of origin, keywords like the disciplines that I might publish in or work in, and then other identifiers. So there are other persistent identifiers for people, mostly in the proprietary space, but those can also be connected to your ORCID record. So if those are included on other contributions that you've made, they can all point back to here. And then here are various kinds of affiliations and contributions for our researchers. Employment, where someone works. Education, where someone went to school. Invited positions, distinctions, and the membership and service. Those are brand new fields because the community told us that education and employment doesn't reflect all of the ways that researchers are contributing to their organizations. Funding, so if you got a grant, the grant organization could push that award into your ORCID record. Works, obviously, so works with identifiers can be added to an ORCID record. So papers, data sets, performances, models, software, patents. We have many, many different kinds of works that can be added here. And if there are things that aren't reflected there yet and you believe they should be, we can take that under consideration. We want any kind of work to be included here if researchers are participating in them. And then peer review. If you're participating in peer review, you're doing peer review for a journal, those journals can also put that information based on the peer review method that they use, include more or less information about that review. But that's service that researchers often do and don't get a whole lot of recognition for. So this is infrastructure now for those reviews to be acknowledged. So then looking at when we say global scale and who we're talking about when we talk about ORCID, I mentioned almost we're getting towards 6 million researchers that have registered for an ID. About 2.3 million of those have data that's been connected to their records by other organizations, like their works. 35 million works have been added to records, 600,000 grants and peer reviews, and then many education and employment items. So that's data that's been added to those records, and that's been zero manual entry for those individuals. All that data has been added by publishers, by repositories, by funders, and the data provenance is always included in that information. And the organizations depositing that information are our ORCID members. We're a nonprofit funded almost entirely by those member organizations and an annual fee that they pay to participate. We'll hit 1,000 organizations on January 1st. We'll be a little over 50 countries once that comes through on January 1st. And between those members, they have built connections to almost more than 500 different systems. So that accounts for many, many different kinds of repositories and many kinds of publishing systems, and many things that research institutions like universities are involved in have built connections to the ORCID registry through our APIs. And then we're up to 21, or at least as of January 1st, we'll be up to 21 national ORCID consortia being groups of ORCID members that join and work together, usually on specific goals. And in some cases, this is across entire countries. Some of these very well coordinated in terms of their national goals, using infrastructure like ORCID to work on their research goals. For example, Italy has a national requirement for every researcher to have an ORCID ID. Otherwise, they don't get to participate in their annual reviews, which is not good for them. So some of these are further along than others. We also have disciplinary consortia, one in the US for just nonprofit funders, also similarly working on goals together, strategic goals. And then next year sometime we'll start seeing some of the federal agencies also develop consortia just for within themselves, and the various subgroups and agencies and projects within those agencies will also form a similar consortium where they'll work together on ORCID and infrastructure goals. So then looking at these procedures and the how this works and why we work with all of these different organizations. So these are the big three. There are other organizations in scholarly and research communication, but these are the big three: the universities, the labs, the agencies being employers, the funders that provide grants for research, and then publishers. But right now, these are very, very different systems that they use to collect information about researchers and then hopefully connect that information back to researchers somehow. So that information does not talk to each other between those organizations or systems. But what they can do is use an ORCID record, the individual here being in the middle of our diagram here, the employer, so that NOAA, for example, could add the information to that individual's ORCID record that they are a researcher at a program here at NOAA. So that that information about their affiliation with NOAA is in their ORCID record, and the source of that information is clear in the API or in the UI that NOAA added that information. That person, that individual, can't go and change that. That data provenance is always secure. So now that information is on the individual's ORCID record, and NOAA is collecting information about that person and what their activities are. So now this person goes and applies for a grant. That funder obviously wants to know what this person does, who they do it for. So they're going to collect information about that researcher, including that NOAA affiliation that we just put there in that person's ORCID record. And then when the funder says that this is valuable research and the grant should be awarded, pushes that grant award information into that person's ORCID record, which then NOAA can pull in so that they can track all of those grants that their researchers are participating in. And then based on that grant, the researcher needs to publish papers. And when the publisher collects that ORCID ID of that individual, they collect the information about where they work and their funding. So now the publisher can, not only will they know that information, but they can connect that paper to the funder, to the exact award that inspired or created the data for that paper, as well as their employer. So now NOAA or the funder that needs to keep track of what their researchers are doing can use those identifiers to easily track back the papers, the contributions, the data sets that are related to their organization or to their grant through identifiers, ORCID being the one for people, but also DOIs for objects, grant IDs for grants. So now these systems can exchange data about what each other are doing through that ORCID record, and that individual is, rather than having to update all these things manually to send to their funder or to their their employer, this information is being updated on their ORCID record with very little manual needs for data entry. So just as an example, on my ORCID record here, we see both two different types of data metadata entry. So I can enter an affiliation myself, but the source will always be me. So you can know how much you're going to trust that information. My affiliation with Orchid here, though, was added by Orchid through the API. That source information will always be included without affiliation. I can't go and edit that information. So your trust in the source of that data is higher. And the same idea for works added in my record. You have some things added by myself, but you also have work that's been added by Crossref and by DataCite. In this case, through an auto-update procedure, everything that gets DOI minted by DataCite that has my ORCID ID included in the metadata will automatically be on my ORCID record. So I don't have to deal with a whole lot of things that I produce end up getting DataCite DOI, so I don't have to update the work section in my ORCID record very often at all, but I'll have dozens of DataCite DOIs in there. And then every object, you can see here, every object in an ORCID record has its own visibility settings. So if someone is uncomfortable with exposing a particular work or grant that they have, they can make that information private. The researcher owns all of the data that's on their ORCID record. They completely control the visibility as well as all of those systems that they connect to. That's up to them who they want to exchange data with. Now we'll talk about that. And we've talked about research, the data ownership, and then that ID being embedded in all of those other metadata or those other identifier types, the DOIs, the grant IDs. By those identifiers overlapping, we can now track that information with much more assurance and reliability than we could relying on names. Oops. So just a sense of who's doing work right now in the federal government doing the exact things that we just walked through. National Institutes of Health has been an ORCID advocate and member for a long time, has their Science CV BioSketch system. Rather than having someone populate that all manually to create their BioSketch that gets sent with their grant proposals, you will just import all of the information from your ORCID ID instead. So save a lot of time that way. The EPA is doing some similar work for their funding submission systems. NASA for their technical information repository. When you submit technical reports or data sets, you'll also include your ORCID ID, and they'll sync it to your ORCID record. FDA starting some work now. DOE has a lot of work going on where they're pushing information about their facilities use and funding. Funding's coming to ORCID records so that they can track the use of their resources like instruments in major facilities that they couldn't track that use before. So that's just started in the last few weeks. USDA, several of their research departments require ORCID IDs for all of their staff so that they can do precisely what we've discussed, so they can track the activity of those researchers and their affiliates. And then we have a number of them that are coming, more federal organizations that will be joining early next year. And just a couple of examples. This is at Asti, at DOE, Office of Science, Technology, Information. Their repository, public access repository, is a really nice ORCID integration. And we've talked about this one a little bit last time I was here. They highly encourage users to connect their ORCID IDs to this system, and a lot of the labs are also collecting IDs locally, and then the data sets or reports are sent to Asti with that ID already included. And you can see here the authors have their ORCID IDs included, so that if this was a particular paper that was of interest to you and you needed to see what these authors, where they work or what they work on, you just click that ID and you go right to their records. You can see what else they have done. This is why I mentioned the research resources that are, the agencies that fund millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on these instruments and facilities, but they are completely unable to track what happens when someone uses those resources. They hope that someone will put that in an acknowledgement of a paper, which then someone has to go digging around to find information in those acknowledgements if they're lucky enough that it's been included in the first place. So we've now have infrastructure for facilities to include that information in an ORCID record, and then the publisher will collect that facility's use when they submit a paper, and they'll link those to identifiers so that the program managers of these facilities will be able to track all of the publications that are related to that, the use of those facilities. And these are just the kinds of facilities that we are expecting. Some of these we see already with computation materials and the major facilities. Expect to see some of these others like ocean missions next year. Collections from the Smithsonian are coming to use these same workflows, and samples being some that are right around the corner for using these same workflows. Let's skip this one for now. This is what a connected grant funding would look like. In this case, a smaller nonprofit funder, Autism Speaks. The grant award information is exposed, an identifier that links back to a landing page for that information that will always resolve to data about that award. And then publishers, when they are, this author, Molly Losh, is submitting a paper, will collect this information about all of her grants, and then we'll link the relevant ones to her paper, so that now Autism Speaks can go and track back all of the papers that are related to their organization and to this particular grant. And publishers, which were an early community adopters for ORCID, about 9,000 journals that are collecting ORCID IDs, 1,400 publishers that deposit ORCID metadata to Crossref, which, similar to DataCite that we saw, has an auto-update procedure. So a DOI that's minted by Crossref that has an ORCID ID included already will automatically go to that user's ORCID record. 1,600 journals, that number's a little higher now, require IDs at the time of manuscript submission. That includes all of the major publishers. They've committed to requiring ORCID IDs. Some of these already have that requirement active, some in progress. Require IDs for every author, every corresponding author on submission, and we're working on facilitating a collection for all authors. It's a little more difficult, but we're working on that. And then publishers, we mentioned, can also recognize the work of the peer review pool in the ORCID record. And this is just a really nice example. It shows all of the major elements, the major identifiers we've discussed here. So this is a paper in bioRxiv. Every author here has an ORCID ID attached. We see a DOI of our paper as our identifier for a thing for the paper. If we were to pull up one of the authors here, in this case Allison, as soon as we open her ORCID record, we can immediately see where she works. The University of Oxford, this information added by the University of Oxford, including an identifier, a persistent identifier for Oxford. So we have our identifier for a place here. And when we scroll down, we can see the paper, the metadata for the paper added by, I think, DataCite in this case, is included in her record as well. So in one record here, we see our identifier for a person, an identifier for a thing, and an identifier for a place. So all those working together now, each of those institutions that are involved in this cycle will be able to connect that information and track that information where that was hardly possible before. And then this is the auto update procedure I mentioned before. If the publisher is collecting an ORCID ID, it'll embed that ID in the metadata rather than relying on it being somewhere sitting in the paper. And then when Crossref or DataCite mint a DOI for that paper, it'll push that information into that user's ORCID record, and it doesn't involve any manual entry on their part. And this is what it looks like the very first time that a user has a paper or an object pushed by Crossref. They'll get a little notification in their ORCID inbox. So the very first time, they'll have to approve this. Everything is always done with approval. So they'll give that approval this first time, and then now DataCite and Crossref will continue adding those works in perpetuity until that person decides they no longer trust Crossref or DataCite. That information is going to continue to be added, and that gets added as soon as that DOI is minted. So often the authors are getting that information in their ORCID record before they even get an email from their publishers. It happens very, very quickly. And then, of course, the institutions that are connected to them, their university or their agency or their lab, pulls all of those new publication information so that they can track in almost real time the activities that those researchers are involved in. Skip that one there. So how does ORCID help? On a broadly speaking here, researchers can easily share their affiliations, contributions, and resources used. The value right away for the researchers, save a whole lot of time, and they get a more trusted way to share their information. Transparent assertions are created in a robust machine and human, readable and interoperable manner, and with researcher permission, always with that permission, which is a value added for the community as a whole for that entire diagram. And then those assertions underpin an open graph of connections between people, places, and things, enabling tracking and reporting through article and the ORCID record metadata. So the institutions are going to save a lot of time and resources by being able to track this information through identifiers. So that's my prepared talk, but I very much like to know what your questions or thoughts are, and I think I could probably show live things if you have interest in that too. Yeah.
I have a question about have you had anybody approach you and try and figure out how they might add orchids to past researchers that were part of an institution in order to backtrack and understand reach for that author?
So to add an affiliation to that person's record or to collect information from them?
Yeah, so let's say a NOAA member had been retired for 10 years, but they were a huge name and they did some really impactful research. Would there be a way to disambiguate them, their past work? And have any projects been in the work on something like that? Because I assume it would be a lot of legwork for somebody to go track that material down.
Okay, so yeah, yes, of course. So the question was about for researchers, whether they're retired or even still in the organization, they've had years and years of works before right now that they still need to associate, both for their case and for your organization to be able to track them. What's involved in getting that information under their ORCID records. So we have a number of ways to get information like works into a user's ORCID record. One of those being the auto update that we saw. So that's mostly going to be used for things you're publishing from when you get to your record created forward. But we have a number of methods to go and get your previous works. So we're connected, to a number of indexes like Scopus and Web of Science and PubMed, Crossref metadata search, and if their works exist in those indexes, they can very, very quickly through the ORCID UI go and grab all of their works. They would search, obviously not by their ORCID ID because they just got one, but they can search by their name, the information they know about themselves. And we've done workshops where they'll just go and do this live, and in 10 minutes they'll add 150 works. It's very, very fast.
Let's say this person is findable though, right? They retired 10, 15 years ago. Who knows if they're even alive still?
Right.
What's the protocol with that? Has anyone approached you with looking at that type of information?
Yeah. So if you were completely out of contact, the resources are limited. Everything that we've talked about here happens with permission from the researcher. It's only a one-time permission for NOAA or for a publisher to interact with that record, but it has to happen. So if that person is off the grid, it's going to be very difficult to connect with them. If you can connect with them at all, though, all of this is possible. So that would be tricky. If someone's passed away, then an ORCID record can't be created for them. So the infrastructure has a limit in that case. That doesn't mean that information can't be collected, but it just won't be through an ORCID record.
Is that due to legal issues?
Yeah, the owner of the record and everything on it is that user. So you can't mint ORCID IDs for people, for example. You couldn't, NOAA couldn't say, we want everyone to have one. Here's your ORCID ID. They have to go and register for that, and we have ways that organizations can facilitate that registration for their users, but it can't just pop up and suddenly have one. That's both a legal concern, particularly this year. Yeah.
It's a piece of metadata, so I'm wondering how that works, because it's only, in a way it's assigning a metadata number to a person. I don't see I don't see anything ethically wrong with that if you're just trying to track the research.
But it belongs to them though, and that's the key. And in fact, we did try this to have universities mint IDs, and not only is it an ethical gray area, but it was a logistical disaster, because then all those IDs are out there, whether those faculty know it or not. And then when they go to create an ID themselves, they're like, okay, I'm going to publish my paper. Let me go get this ID. Suddenly, they're being told that the one already exists for them, and it becomes a huge problem. So we walked that availability of that feature back pretty quickly.
Try that at some point.
It was tried just to get, really to get that adoption up, and it did not work at all. So that'll never happen again. And then with GDPR this year makes that decision a lot easier, because the reason we don't run into a lot of problems with GDPR is everything is opt-in. As far as ORCID is concerned, your registration is opt-in. Someone can't do it for you. Connecting with systems like the ones we talked about today happens with you making that authorized button. It only takes you 10 seconds, but only you can do it. So that's why we haven't run into problems that you would think, dealing with identities, GDPR would have been a difficulty, but we haven't run into any issues.
Tell us what GDPR is. That the European privacy?
Yeah, the General Data Protection Regulation.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in Europe, but it applies to all EU citizens. So that doesn't matter where they are. So really, it just means it's an international regulation at this point. So it's become a problem for a lot of organizations. But because everything has been opt-in for a long time, and we do regular reviews from security and experts, including in Germany, where they're really serious about all of this, and we've yet to hit any red flags, and that's because we don't take steps like we did before. That was several years ago, and as I said, it won't happen again. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the researcher has to give permission to share the data with funders, etc. Do you have any idea what percentage of researchers check that they're willing to share their data, and is the lack of willingness to share problematic for funding agencies who are trying to compile statistics on, how the data are being published, research being used to make published literature out there? I mean, is it like half equal?
So when I say that they're asking for permission, this is what that looks like. So when Crossref in this case, but it would look the same for a funder, would say, we would like permission to see this data that's on your ORCID record, as well as perhaps, like in Crossref's case or a funder's case, add information to your ORCID record.
So does that happen at the time when they apply for a grant, or?
So, well, that depends on their workflows, but in the most cases for a funder, it would be while that they're submitting a proposal, they would also be asked, say, put your name, put your email address, and then a button that says connect your Orchid ID. And they'll click that, and they'll sign into their Orchid record so that this is the person that you think it is, and then they'll get this. And it'll ask specifically what permissions that institution or that organization is asking for. In this case, is read items on your Orchid record and create or update your activities. And then the user just hits authorize or deny. And that's it. So it's not a real burdensome process for them to get through that step. So when we there is data on every single Orchid client, hundreds of them, on what happens when the user gets here. And what we've been working with members to do is have real clear communication before they even get to this point on what that institution is asking for. And when that communication is clear, overwhelmingly they are authorizing at this stage. It's well over half, and it'll be different for each organization. But I think because it's consistent, and every time they're submitting papers, they see something that looks like this. When they submit a grant, they see something that looks like this. When their university connects with them, it looks like this. It's very, very consistent, so that the user now, the researcher, is used to this. It becomes a habit, and they trust this process. So we're seeing 95% and up in a lot of cases.
We have a couple questions online.
Okay.
Okay, so this might be something that someone at NOAA might have to answer as well, but just to go with this, how would NOAA join as an organizational member?
Okay. So all Orchid members, those 950 we have now and the 1,000 we'll have January 1st, sign an agreement that indicate their responsibilities to us and our responsibilities to them. Pretty straightforward. We have a specific one for government organizations because they have specific needs to be a subscriber to the Orchid services. And there's an annual fee. We have a couple of levels for that fee. It's a little over $5,000 for a basic membership, which does everything that we talked about here. And then we have a higher premium level that does everything and a little bit more, plus having more clients available for each organization. So as I mentioned, we saw some of the federal agencies that are already working on this. We'll probably see 10 more next year at least. Annual fee, yeah.
So if NOAA doesn't join, how can how can they use Orchid to be a funder? How do they become a funder on Orchid?
Become a funder.
Yes, if like a NOAA program funds something and they want to be known as the funder, how would they do that? Okay,
well, so in order to push funding information like we saw here, that would require an Orchid membership. Let's scroll back here. Oh, there we go. So in order to have something like this, to have an award that comes from NOAA and have the source be a NOAA client, that would require Orchid membership.
As an organization?
Yes, yeah. Now, a lot of the other things we talked about today are up to the individual to start participating in. So in order for you to start getting information about what your researchers or community are doing, they would start doing this. So you can encourage, you can advocate, you can show them some of this. All of that would happen without a membership. Now, membership means I could come and help you do some of that stuff, whereas my time is somewhat limited, if not. But a lot of this does come down to being able to get your community to start using it. Because even if you do become a member later, the more that they're using it already, the better your data is going to be right away.
We have one other question. If a user already has a researcher ID, how quickly can they import that into Orchid?
So if they have a researcher ID already, they can, that's the Thomson Reuters, just a persistent identifier for a person, similar to what Orchid is here. And they can, through the Thomson Reuters, we have, again, a wizard through the UI for them to connect, too many clicks, to connect information, including works, to their record. It makes that gathering of information very, very quick. And one of them will be connecting to the Thomson Reuters systems. And what it'll do is it'll also import and connect here their researcher ID. So I guess I could pull up my Orchid record. I have my researcher ID included. It's been added by Thomson Reuters to my Orchid records. Now those identifiers are connected. Yeah.
So considering you're a not-for-profit and a lot of researchers who are putting their faith into you guys and for longevity, how confident and what's the strategy long term to make sure that this doesn't disappear?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So there's a few things.
Can you repeat it?
Yes. So the question being, as a nonprofit, our sustainability is always a question, but what we're trying to do here is not the 5-year plan, it's a 50-year plan of making sure this information is available. So how do we make sure that that's the case and this registry continues to exist even if the organization falls apart for some reason? So a few things as a structure. We're a nonprofit and we also can't be sold to a for-profit organization. So that's protection against what we have seen a lot of in research in recent years, is a consolidation of what were previously non-proprietary tools into proprietary systems, which can affect, maybe they still exist, but they'd be very different than they were before. So that won't happen with Orchid. Our board has to be 2/3 nonprofit research institution, so we might have a for-profit publisher or funder or something on the board, but it's going to be majority research institutions. So those are some of the protections right now. And then in terms of sustainability, technically, all of our resources, every bit of code that we produce is entirely open. Everything about the registry, every feature that we have, all of the API, XML and XLS, all available, completely open. So if we were to all disappear, the 30 of us, someone could pick it up right away and continue to make sure the registry is running. And we also have a public data file that is produced of the Orchid registry, every bit of public information that we dump once a year for anyone to access. So even if all of the data were to go, for some reason, to go away, there's always a record of that information that's available.
Does any money come from grants that you receive, like IMLS or anybody else?
Yeah, we have, right now, the vast majority of our funding is from those members, but we have received grants, or at least partner in grants. Helmsley Foundation was one several years ago that helped us grow our team. I wrote or collaborated on a grant for the Belmont Forum that we'll find out about in the next couple of weeks, whether that will move forward. So a lot of times we're partnering with several other organizations and we'll in some way get some of that funding. It's usually for specific kinds of infrastructure projects that maybe Crossref and DataSite are also working on. So we'll be part of those.
I have one last question online, and it's maybe more of a text question. But if someone is a peer reviewer and they're looking at their peer review section on their Orchid record and it's not showing up, what can they do about that, or is it someone else's job?
Right. So here on our Orchid record, on a brand new Orchid record, this is in terms of the sections available, this is everything that's available, and you can go in and add things manually to these sections. There are 2 sections that you will not see and you can't add information manually. One of those is peer review. One of those is the research resources that we discussed, the facilities and instruments and collections. Those are only can be added by the API by another organization. That is to make sure that data integrity is intact. And at some point, it would be great if we didn't have any manual entry, but right now, that's not a possibility. There's not integration with enough of the systems to make that possible. With peer review, we have pretty decent coverage. Publons, being an aggregator of peer review information, will also push information to ORCID records. So there's a number of ways for those individuals that don't have anything yet to have that section appear and their peer review information. That might be to encourage their journals to participate, or publishers, but also maybe Publons would be that would help them with that. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure this isn't, widespread or anything, but what about fraudulent attribution? What have you guys been faced with in that area, and what steps do you take if you receive a report of something like that?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question is about fraudulent attribution of a paper or a data set, or even an affiliation somehow. Certainly that's a possibility. Even you going as far back as someone could create a record and put someone else's name and information on it. I could say that in both cases, having spent a lot of time looking at the concerns and getting the direct messages from ORCID individuals, I have only seen a handful of times where there was a misattribution of some kind, and almost always it's a mistake where someone went to one of the indexes and claimed a paper that belonged to someone else. And so in that case, we'll communicate with both parties to make sure that we understand what the case is, and then those individuals will take care of that. They'll remove that paper and the other individual can add it. We won't go in and mess with data unless it is super, super broken. We are not the curators of ORCID records. We won't touch anyone's data. So we rely on those individuals to make that happen. And if they weren't able to resolve it, we can elevate that. And but I've never seen it. So for almost a year and a half, I've never seen one.
I think we're right up on time. So thank you so
Cool.
much, Eric.
Thank you.